The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Richard Kahlenberg. He's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights. Richard Kahlenberg, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, glad to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. It has been just over 50 years since Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. To mark this sad anniversary, you wrote a report for the Century Foundation titled The Inclusive Populism of Robert F. Kennedy. And you note that when Robert Kennedy began his campaign to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination, he faced a challenge: how to unite working-class whites and African Americans. What was happening in that moment that made it such a challenge?
Well, there were two big things going on. For years, under Franklin Roosevelt and subsequent Democrats, there was a strong coalition of working-class whites and African Americans around common issues of class inequality. But then there were two disruptors. The first was the civil rights movement, which was sweeping the country in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and there were some working-class whites, particularly in the South, who were resistant to that, and we saw many of them swing to Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. But it was more complicated than just white racism. There was also a fair amount of rioting going on in 1965, 66, 67. Cities were burning, and many working-class whites were upset about that, didn't feel that progressives were reacting strongly enough to that. And then the second big issue was Vietnam. I think most historians recognize that the Vietnam War was really a mistake. There were a lot of missteps by the United States, but at the time, many white working-class voters saw some of the protests on college campuses and elsewhere as going too far in their view, going after American patriotism. And so those two things were driving working-class whites and African Americans and Latinos, who had been natural allies, apart at that moment. And Robert Kennedy, who was entering the 1968 presidential campaign, was put in an awkward position because he was in favor of civil rights. He was opposed to the Vietnam War. So the easiest alliance would have been for him to put together a coalition of kind of upper middle class, educated whites and African Americans and Latinos. But he waited too long to get into the race, and Senator Eugene McCarthy was already in the race as the peace candidate and got many of those upper middle class voters. So Robert Kennedy had to try to cobble together that difficult coalition of working class whites and African Americans.
Yeah, and your report goes into great detail about how Robert Kennedy went about rebuilding that coalition, and it begins with his focus on economics. What was his message?
Well, he told a reporter, Jack Newfield, we have to convince, in the parlance of the time, Negroes and poor whites to see their common interests. And so he pounded away at what he thought was really the easiest issue for people to understand, which is that wealthy people in this country were not paying their fair share of taxes, and they were not carrying the weight that they should. And moreover, he would make it more vivid by going after particular people. So he would name names. He would talk about a billionaire, H.L. Hunt, who was paying $200 in taxes, and it really went after that. The business community was strongly opposed to Robert Kennedy on this issue of taxation, and they. He in the polls, he was the least popular among all the various candidates. The other thing is he was really relentless on this issue of economic inequality. Sometimes today, progressives will talk about economic inequality and then shift to lots of other issues. And it wasn't episodic for Robert Kennedy. He pounded away at those issues relentlessly.
Well, and as you also write in your report, he knew he had to go beyond economics to social issues such as law and order, but we know that the law and order issue can be used by some candidates as a dog whistle appeal to racism. How did Robert Kennedy avoid that?
Yeah, he was very careful to talk about law and order in a way that was quite different than someone like Governor George Wallace, the segregationists, or Richard Nixon, who would use law and order in a way that had a strong racial undertone. This was part of Robert Kennedy's larger effort to say we not only have to respect the interests of working class people, but their values as well. And so law and order at a time when there's widespread rioting going on in city after city was very popular among working class people, really of all races. I mean, Kennedy didn't want to be for lawlessness and disorder. He really ran as one colleague put it, as kind of the sheriff of the country. He reminded people that he was had been as Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer, and yet he always coupled that message of law and order, which is a phrase he did use, with a strong civil rights message, a strong message of anti-discrimination. And he would say to audiences of white factory workers, imagine if you couldn't get a job, to support your family because of the color of your skin. Imagine not being able to find a home in the neighborhood that you wanted because people were discriminated against you. So he talked about the need to maintain order, but at the same time always talked about what was the root source of that anger in the African American community, and the need to address those sources as well.
And he also broached the divisive issue of welfare without evoking the racist image of the welfare queen. How did he challenge welfare with an inclusive appeal? Yeah.
Well, in later years, Ronald Reagan was famous for talking about welfare queens, people who were cheating the system. And Robert Kennedy was also critical of welfare, but from a very different angle. So in one of his TV commercials, he talked about, he said, I think welfare is demeaning and destructive of the human being and his family. So he wasn't for that policy. He really wanted to give people jobs so that they could feel good about themselves and have meaning in their lives. And so in one of his ads, he talked about the idea that someone should be able to go home and say to his or her family, I helped build this country. I am a participant in its greatest public venture. To be employed was, in any capacity, was something to be honored. And so Robert Kennedy did have that anti-welfare message, but in a way that was uplifting of people who who were on welfare.
We're speaking with Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights. Richard, this campaign took place in the middle of a very unpopular war in Vietnam, as you had alluded to earlier. How was he able to balance being tough on national security with a position that questioned the morality of the Vietnam War?
Right. So everyone in the country knew that Robert Kennedy was opposed to the Vietnam War, the way it was being conducted. He was very clear on that issue and talked about this as a question of morality. At the same time, he was able to communicate a toughness on national security issues that was different than other progressives at the time, or many other progressives at the time. And one way he did that was to suggest that he was not going to side with kind of upper middle class white college students who were protesting the war in a way that was disrespectful to the United States. And moreover, he went after kind of the class inequality aspects of the Vietnam War. And he told students at Notre Dame, it is unfair that you get a deferment from service in the war because you are in college. And so, those images would be broadcast on the evening news, and people knew that, yes, he had questions about the Vietnam War, but he wasn't siding with protesters who many working-class whites viewed as unsympathetic and unpatriotic. And as a result, there was some fascinating polling which suggested that Robert Kennedy, even though he was a peace candidate, did as well with supporters of the Vietnam War as opponents of that war.
That's interesting. Now, of course, we did not get to find out if he would have won the nomination, but what can you say about his campaign? Was it working?
It was remarkable. So he ran in a series of primaries, building up towards the California primary where he was assassinated, and in those primaries he was clearly on the road towards rebuilding this coalition of African Americans, Latinos, and working class whites, including many working class whites who in previous elections had supported George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama. Some of the best evidence comes from the state of Indiana, where in precincts where Wallace had done quite well in 1964, when he was challenging Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination, Robert Kennedy also did well in those precincts. There's a lot of polling evidence to suggest that Kennedy, for many voters, the choice came down to one between Robert Kennedy and George Wallace. And this is truly remarkable because on the issue of civil rights, they were at polar opposites. Robert Kennedy was seen as the most sympathetic to making progress on civil rights, whereas George Wallace was the strongest opponent of advancements on civil rights. And yet, Kennedy was able to appeal not only to African Americans and Latinos, but also to these working class whites who, many of whom had supported Governor Wallace.
What was it about this man that made him not only commit to an inclusive kind of populism, but be successful at it?
Yeah, well, I think much of it had to do with his particular biography. He was the brother of a slain and martyred president, John F. Kennedy, and so there was some of his appeal that was derivative of John Kennedy's success with working class whites and African Americans. Part of it had to do with a personal toughness. He'd been campaign manager for his brother. He'd been attorney general. He'd been a prosecutor who went after labor leader Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters and corruptions in the unions, and so that was part of his appeal. But fundamentally, he had a basic respect for people of all races, and so I was at a book event with where I heard his daughter Kathleen Kennedy Townsend speaking, and the question was raised: would Robert Kennedy have said that large chunks of the American population are deplorables? And she said it never would have occurred to him in a million years to say something like that. He had too much respect for people and wanted to meet them where they were and try to bring out the best in them.
Boy, could we go for a dose of that today. And speaking of today, as you look out today at our political landscape, as many progressive Democrats struggle with these same issues, why is this still such a hard issue?
Well, I think that many Democrats are rightfully suspicious of the pervasive racism that is continues to plague our society, and at the same time, that leads them in too many situations to have a condescending attitude toward non-college educated voters in this country, the kind of a feeling of moral superiority that fails to recognize that working class and low income people of all races are hurting in this country. Van Jones tells a powerful story about a working class white father who'd been laid off from his job. He's got two kids. One is his son is on opioids and struggling for that reason. And then his daughter, who he's so proud of, goes off to college. And she comes back from college and starts lecturing him about his white privilege and patriarchal attitudes. And that's not the best way to reach voters like that. We don't need to scold or lecture people. We need to understand and really be more inclusive in our populism. Obviously, avoiding the terrible right-wing and racist populism of Donald Trump, but also being more inclusive of working class people of all races. I think that's one of the big lessons for progressives today. That here we have a model of Robert Kennedy, someone who was able to bridge that divide.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the specific policies you think that can be successful in realizing Robert Kennedy's vision?
I think the broader theme should be policies that embrace a liberalism without elitism on the one hand, and a populism without racism on the other. And so there are a number of specific policies that can embody that idea. One would be to go after corporations that are failing us. I mean, after the 2008 economic crisis, there was a sense that some of these banks were too big to fail, and also that they're too big to jail. And there's a lot of anger over that set of issues, and so I think that's part of what progressives could do today. The other big thing is to think about ways to get at the class inequality in our country and learn from the civil rights movement. Ben Jealous, who's running for governor in Maryland, has said that the biggest divide in this country today is not between black and white, it's between rich and poor. And so applying that lesson to particular policy areas could have a big impact. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes employment discrimination illegal. Well, we ought to think about expanding that idea and saying it also ought to be illegal not only to discriminate based on race or gender or religion, but if you are trying to form a union, you're trying to join the middle class, you shouldn't just be fired, which is what employers do now, because while it's a technical violation of labor laws, the penalties are so weak that employers routinely flout the law. So make labor organizing a civil right. Try to integrate our schools by socioeconomic status as well as race, because all the research suggests concentrations of poverty are what drive inequality as opposed to a particular racial makeup. In the area of affirmative action, I think there's a powerful argument for expanding the concept to include disadvantaged people of all races. So President Obama said, his privileged daughters don't deserve a leg up, but economically disadvantaged students of all races, including African American, Latino, Asian, and white, deserve to have that special consideration in college admissions. And the final thing I mentioned is the idea of an economic fair housing act. We've now made it illegal to discriminate, by race in housing. Going back to the 1968 Fair Housing Act, but it's perfectly legal to discriminate based on government policies that treat people differently on the basis of income. So we have in lots of communities zoning laws that in effect say we're going to exclude working class and moderate income people of all races because in this neighborhood you've got to have we can only allow single family homes. We're going to ban apartment buildings, and in some cases they even say you need a certain lot size. I mean, that's blatant economic discrimination, and we ought to be framing these issues in a way that suggests that we've had modest success with the civil rights movement. Let's apply those lessons to economic inequality.
A lot to learn. Richard Kahlenberg, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he focuses on education, equal opportunity, and civil rights, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Richard, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Oh, I would enjoy that very much. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Work your fingers to the bone. What do you get? Boney Fingers. This 1960s song, mocking the vaunted virtue of working hard, is being sung today with new meaning by all kinds of employees, from factory workers to teachers, and even a few upper-floor executives. The rebellion here is not merely over low pay, but particularly about the unrelenting nature of work itself, the all-consuming job imperative, as if that's your life. Go 40 to 60 hours a week, 50 to 52 weeks a year for half a century or more, then die. Is that all there is? Is that all we are? Amazingly, this existential, truly revolutionary question is one that millions of hardworking people today throughout our top-down corporate system are asking themselves, their families, and friends. Why are we working like this? Why does it matter? What else is there? Airline pilots, for example, have stunned the industry by prioritizing non-monetary demands in their current contract negotiations with the Big Four monopolistic airline giants. The bosses have offered 14% pay hikes, but pilots are demanding something more meaningful, structural changes to improve their quality of life. They're routinely frustrated by management's inept scheduling, inadequate staffing, and onerous work rules that leave them stressed out, dangerously fatigued, and even stranded far from home. The bottom line is not to get another dollar, but being able to plan and enjoy a non-work life. You absolutely cannot address quality of life with money, says the president of the pilots union at Southwest Airlines. You're never going to pay someone enough for a lost piano recital with their daughter or a lost baseball game. This is Jim Hightower saying, there are many compromises required to make a living these days, but we humans are finally beginning to say, enough. You can buy my hard work, but not my life.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And our guest joining us now, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Lieutenant Governor in the state of Maryland, chair of the Board of Advisors for the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, well, it's really good to be with you.
All right. You recently had an opinion piece in the Washington Post titled, Sarah Palin is Wrong About John F. Kennedy, Religion, and Politics. Sarah Palin makes some statements about your uncle, John F. Kennedy, in her new book. And she says that he tried to run away from religion, that he failed to tell Americans how his faith had enriched him. Is she right?
Well, I think the question is, should he have done that? And I think that to make how faith enriches you part of the political dialogue can have dangerous consequences, because people who hold faith very dear to them might start to judge you on your faith and the depth of your faith. And I think that what we're trying to do in the United States is judge people not on their faith, but on what their policies are and their programs are. If you do it on the basis of their faith, you run into the issue of a religious test, which is unconstitutional. And and that's what I believe she is getting very close to the arguing for what would be a really unconstitutional program.
Well, religion is part of life. I mean, it's part of, and although there is the separation of church and state, and religion, we all believe, or most of us believe, obviously not Sarah Palin, that religion should be separate from politics. It does constantly seem to creep back into politics. Is that different now than it was back in 1960?
Well, it was certainly strong in 1960, as you know. Norman Vincent Peale sent out a letter saying to all the many Protestant ministers, saying electing a Catholic would mean that the Pope would be in charge of our policy, that it would be very dangerous for America. So that was very much a religious issue. Obviously, when Hubert Humphrey was running in West Virginia, he used as his campaign song, "Give Me That Old Time Religion." He was certainly not talking about a Catholic old-time religion. So there was very much an anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States in 1960. My uncle was well aware of it and knew that it could be dangerous and hurtful to him and to many Catholics who wanted to run for the highest office in the land.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because he took, I believe, somewhere around 80% of the Catholic vote, but he was very, very strong. And you mentioned this in your piece, that he did not want to be considered the Catholic candidate for president, but he was, in fact, and I'm just paraphrasing, I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who also happens to be a Catholic.
Yeah.
Religion today.
I want to make sure that, as he said very eloquently, when people were fighting for the United States in war, they're not asked whether they're Catholic. You didn't ask how many Catholics, those who died at the Alamo weren't asked if they were Catholic or Protestant. And why would you want that same question to be given to people who are running for public office? And obviously you see all the problem if you do that, I think, in the last election when Mitt Romney, in a campaign for president of the United States, has to describe what he thinks about Jesus, as whether Jesus is to him the Son of God. I mean, I don't think that's appropriate. I think some people believe he's the Son of God, some people don't. But if you think that is an important issue, you're going to make your judgment based on that rather than on something else, and then you're starting to divide the country along religious lines, which I think the genius of America, what made America exceptional, is the determination not to have us decide on a candidate based on their religious affiliation.
It seems to me, though, that religion intersects socially, scientifically, and politically more today than ever before. Do we need to change the dialogue? I mean, when you have people like Mitt Romney,
I really don't think. I mean, I have to. I think it's a large part, but it is not. I think it's not as strong as it was with Al Smith when I think he lost the presidential election because he was a Catholic. In other words, I think there's been a long history of religious intolerance in our country. So I don't think this is particularly new. I think it's been part of the challenge that Americans face, as all countries face, to how to choose somebody not based on their faith, but based on what they can do. I mean, it's so ironic, I have to tell you. We go we fight a war in Iraq because we say we want to bring freedom. And they have dangerous divisions between the Sunnis and the Shiites based on religious doctrine. And then we say, and then some people over here say, we should bring religion back into politics. I mean, it's just not what America was founded for. It's not what made us exceptional.
How do you respect freedom of religion without alienating those Americans who identify so strongly with their religion?
Well, it means, what do you mean? I guess the question is, what do you mean by identification? I mean, if you believe that if you want to practice your faith, which means, if you want to go to church on Sunday or every day as my mother does, I don't think I'm interfering with her ability to do that by the policies that I implement. I think she can still go to church every day. If she wants to send her children to Catholic school, she can do that. I don't think our policies hurt that. What we don't allow is that we say that we're not going to use tax dollars to proselytize, and I think that's that's a very important distinction.
Is religion then, when we're talking about some of the comments that a Sarah Palin or a Mitt Romney, is just the two samples that we've talked about so far, have brought up, are they using it then? Are they using it politically on purpose without really giving it any thought about the separation?
It's always a very good question to judge why people do certain things. And that's the danger with religion. Why are they bringing up religion? Is it because they sincerely believe it, or because they think that they're going to garner votes by doing this in a particular way? And I think that religion and one's relationship to God should be more precious than to be used politically. So I don't feel like I should be in a position of judging, why do they do that? I can be in a position of judging that I think it's a bad idea. And I think it's a bad idea and not in line with what America offers the world, which is not to have us engage in these kind of religious disputes.
Interestingly, as I grew up and attended Catholic school, grade school, and when I was growing up, and we're talking about in the 60s, there was basically, in the mainstream, or for what we were taught essentially, there was Christianity and there was Judaism. and there wasn't really a lot of mention of any other religions. And today, that's a lot different. Is ignorance coming into play nowadays when we're talking about religions that perhaps we're just not familiar with? You immediately, I think of Muslims that have to walk around scared right now in the United States.
Well, I think it's actually funny that you said when you were growing up there were Christians and Jews, because you grew up in the 60s. Well, I grew up in the 50s, and Catholics weren't really considered Christians. Christians were a different group. We were Catholics, and it's really funny kind of, and there's still sort of a sense that Catholics really Christians because we have a pope. It's fascinating about that. You can say it's ignorance, but it might be, it may be ignorance. It may be to beat up on a different religion is a way to gain power for yourself. You know what you're doing, and you're doing it on purpose. So I'm not sure sometimes whether things are out of ignorance or out of just meanness. I mean, I think people can know what they're doing and just not be kind and generous and compassionate.
What do people need to do?
In other words, you can know things are wrong and you do it anyway. Like, people smoke. They know it's bad for you and they do it because for other reasons. So I don't think ignorance is always the answer to why people do things that aren't very helpful.
Sarah Palin, because we're talking again with Kathleen Kennedy Townsend and specifically about the opinion piece that Kathleen wrote in the Washington Post, Sarah Palin is wrong about John F. Kennedy, religion, and politics. Right. And I do sort of believe that she is, in fact, using religion inappropriately here. But how do you go and get that belief across to constituents that perhaps are swayed by some of the things that she or Mitt Romney or others might say?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. I wrote this article a couple of weeks ago, and she's never responded. And she hasn't come back with a response, which leads me to believe that she is being persuaded that this is not an argument that she is on the winning side of. It was so obvious that she was judging people in the piece when she would say that Nancy Pelosi doesn't walk the walk, as though she can judge whether somebody walks God's walk. I think that is, I think most Americans don't want their politicians telling us who is saved and who isn't. Mm-hmm. I think that would, I don't know when she wrote the book, whether, she paid close enough attention to what she was doing. But I hope my article pointed out just how dangerous the path that she was going down. And I may be wrong, maybe tomorrow she will attack it and defend what she did. But interestingly enough, she hasn't so far. That is interesting because you make that strong an argument one way. Maybe I haven't read the papers myself, but I did this Washington Post conversation online, and I found very, very few people attacked my article at all. Maybe you've seen it, but most people kind of agreed with it. I read a lot of I didn't read all of them, but I did read a good number of them, and there were very, very few that disagreed with. They really disagreed. And it might be just the Washington Post reporters, readers, so there's always that sort of slant. But I found it kind of interesting how few people said, no, you don't get it. So I think that I believe that probably we haven't really discussed this fully, and that the fact that I was able to write this and got such wide attention, I have to tell you, it get broad attention, I think made the argument that John Kennedy was correct. Yeah, indeed. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, author of the book Failing America's Faithful, How Today's Churches Are Mixing God with Politics and Losing Their Way. We appreciate your time with us today, Kathleen. We look forward to talking to you again soon. Hey, it was fun to be with you. Thank you. We want you to sit back and listen to this AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
sort of the new strategy on the part of the anti-abortion organizations to try to lock the ban into the Constitution, because that way it's harder to change?
Yeah, I think, what the Supreme Court handed us is in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision means that they're forcing a nationwide public health crisis. So the question is being returned to the states, and state constitutions offer at this point really the only legal basis by which a state can protect access to abortion. So we're going to see this state by state. As of right now, 14 states have banned abortion since the Supreme Court's decision came down. We think more are expected to do so in the coming days and weeks and months. And so, this is very confusing. This is a devastating moment. It is complicated. So that was the right word to use.
Yeah.
Because it is literally your healthcare depends on your zip code.
Wow. Yeah. And red state or blue state, or and are there any limits allowed, or is that out in, for example, in Kansas or most of these other states where it's locked into the Constitution, or is it just an outright ban, no exceptions?
So what we've seen so far, West Virginia is probably going to vote very soon, is that the approach in many of these states is an outright ban, so without exceptions. There are, other examples of states where it's not, all hope is not lost. We know that there are places like Michigan where they have an old law on the books. That law from the 1930s says that abortion is banned, and if since Roe fell, they would look to return a complete ban on abortion. Again, language from 1930 shouldn't apply to our healthcare today. So the governor there really is the question on the ballot is going to make a big difference for access in that state, because being able to retain a Democratic governor in Gretchen Whitmer means that you can protect abortion access. So, it really has been 6-week bans, 15-week bans. We've seen an array of things. But what I think we would say from Planned Parenthood is a ban is a ban is a ban, and bans are not popular. This is not where voters really are. We know that there's no state in the country where banning abortion is popular. People do not want to see their rights taken away.
So that gets us to the big question. You mentioned the Dobbs decision. It was just about a month ago, June 24, that decision came down. Last week, the Supreme Court, which it has to do, the official transmission of that decision to the lower courts. So we now are in at least for now, a post-Roe world. What obstacles do women face, do you see in this post-Roe world? And are we already seeing some of those obstacles?
Unfortunately, it's not just been since the last 4 weeks. Back in September of 2021, we saw the state of Texas be the first state to step up and ban. So they now have been operating for months where abortion after 6 weeks is not legal. And that state has actually taught us a lot about what we're seeing now and how to respond. And we know that the stories we're starting to hear from people, it is very unsettling. People driving thousands of miles, having to take time off work, having to get childcare, having to come in for their appointment and not actually knowing the current law in their state because things are so rapidly changing. We know that in all these places, we're seeing providers also really confused. We've heard in states like Texas where doctors are calling lawyers before they're actually providing healthcare service because they are afraid of getting in illegal complications. And, we've heard stories of women who've said, I had a complication with my pregnancy. I went to the emergency room only to be told, go home, wait until you have sepsis and your life is at risk, then we can actually help you without getting in trouble with the law. So we know that this is a really complicated landscape. It's very confusing, and it's not just about abortion access. It's also for people who may have pregnancy complications, being unclear. And so, the task at hand right now is that we have to not be overwhelmed by these facts on the ground and make sure that we are focused at Planned Parenthood on getting patients to care and getting people to the care where the care is available. But I do believe the entire healthcare system is going to see ripples from this decision. Just because, from hospital administrators to state by state patchwork, it's just not the way to deliver healthcare. So, it's going to be a moment in time where I think no one can be neutral on this question, because it's whether you think access to abortion impacts your life or not, it really is going to sit at everyone's feet.
So it's been 50 years. For 50 years, Roe v. Wade was in place. I'm guessing, I should have looked this up, but that most American women alive today were not born before 1973, right? I mean, the majority of American women have this has been their life, the protection of Roe v. Wade. Do you find at Planned Parenthood that women understand the consequences, realize what's going on and what's been taken away from them? Do they get it?
Yeah, no, people can't get it, right? Because if I'm in Wisconsin, my healthcare looks very different. And if I'm in New York or California, here's what is breaking through. People understand what the Supreme Court's decision means is that those 50 years of rights have been taken away. And I think that has instilled a lot of rage and a lot of interest in taking action this fall. But people are, as you said, we've never seen a Supreme Court take rights away. We haven't had this opportunity. So, we're focused on delivering care. Our movement side is really focused on helping people dissent and express their rage where we can. We're working through the courts to try to disrupt abortion bans. We are starting to see, from Justice Breyer's opinion, that we already have seen the dissent name young women are living at a time where they will have less rights than their mothers and grandmothers. And it is already happening where we've seen young people having to make decisions about where to go to college, young women who are new in their professional careers, making decisions about what corporations they want to join, depending on what state that they're based in. I had a mother of a young college graduate say to me as she enters into the workforce, I want to think about where she lives. She's getting to graduate, get married, have kids. If she has a pregnancy complication, what can I do to be able to help her? So there are economic consequences that states have to think about right now.
And that's where the focus has shifted now. The Supreme Court has forced that. The focus has shifted to the states. I saw that the Guttmacher Institute, they predict that some 26 states will end up with a ban on abortion. Is that what you see at Planned Parenthood? And this is the new battleground, isn't it, state by state?
Yeah, we do predict that there. Agree with Guttmacher, the 26 states potentially could ban abortion. We already are at the number currently is 14. And so we know many will return to session. State legislators will return to session in January of 2023, and we expect many more to be added to that list. And, the reality is that if you have 26 states that have banned abortion, the remaining 24 just cannot hold, all of the patient services for the entire country. So people are going to go without healthcare. And, we are continuing to think about things like expanding telehealth access, making sure that people are able to get support from travel, and helping where we can, making sure that where it continues to be legal, that we're making sure that people who travel to states and come back to their banned state are not criminalized, because we understand that's a piece that the anti-abortion movement is interested in.
Now, I wanted to ask you about that question. Are women free to travel from an anti-abortion state to where they can get health care, to a state where they can get health care?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember there are going to be a lot of barriers for people. Many patients are already parenting, and so finding childcare, taking time off work, finding the resources to cover transportation and lodging. Not everyone's going to be able to travel, but for those who can, anti-abortion states may try and stop them. And so we've already started to see proposals being drafted by state legislators that would prohibit people from traveling across state lines, making it impossible to access the care that they need, considering criminalizing someone if you give assistance to that person to get out of the state. So we're really appreciative of the fact that, we've already seen in the House and Senate, there's been legislation introduced that by reproductive rights champions that would affirm you do have a right to travel. We're in interesting times, because whoever thought you wouldn't have the right to travel since the days of slavery? As a Black woman in this country, I'm very offended at the idea that you have to reaffirm that right. But I'm glad to see that those bills are being introduced in Congress, reassuring people that you would not be criminalized if you travel.
I don't believe any states are suggesting, for example, that I could not travel to another state to have a vasectomy.
Correct.
Right?
That's right. Yeah. This is how far we've been removed, right?
Or even, to have an appendix removed, right? Or to have a pacemaker installed, or any other medical procedure. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. Our lawyers say all the time, we've always presumed the assumption that you could travel. We've not before been at a time when we've seen anti-abortion legislation introduced that that would block the ability of someone to get health care where they need to. And so they're trying now really, to control where we go, take away our rights across state lines. And essentially, these are areas that politicians just shouldn't be involved in when it comes to personal healthcare decisions.
What penalties, I know it must differ from state to state, but what are you seeing for people within a state who might consult a doctor, consult a health professional, consult a clinic about an abortion procedure, or a medical professional who assists a woman? Or family members who drive her there.
Yeah. What if you're the Uber who picks somebody up?
Yeah, right.
And who takes you there?
They're talking about penalties for everybody involved, correct?
That is exactly right. What this first started in the state of Texas when we saw last September. They put forward and passed, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court, the ability to keep someone from so-called aiding and abetting without definition. So anything could be considered aiding and abetting. I just write a check to my niece and tell her, I want you to feel supported to get your care, right? Who's to say that I couldn't be subject to? I will note that we haven't to date actually seen those lawsuits. Many of those lawsuits haven't been brought. However, we have seen the Attorney General of Texas issue letters to law firms and threatening the licenses of attorneys who are seen as helping or aiding and abetting someone to get out of the state and get the care that they need. So the core of what we're really seeing at these abortion bans are, intimidation. It's doing exactly what it is intended, which is to devastate people's lives and cause this confusion and complications. That's really, what they're going to try and do is intimidate everybody from the hospital administrators to the lawyers to companies. But I've been really encouraged. We have seen many companies join, hundreds and hundreds of companies join our Don't Ban Equality pledge, taking the pledge not to ban equality. And we're starting to see more companies who are making statements about changes to their corporate policies to support employees who need to travel.
Right, and including paying for their travel, I've seen in some cases. Again, our guest today from Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Jacqueline Ayers, who's Senior Vice President for Policy, Campaigns, and Advocacy at Planned Parenthood. Jacqueline, you alluded earlier there are related issues that come into play here, too. Let me ask you about some of them. I've seen stories about even women who might have a miscarriage could get caught under some of this legislation. Tell us about that.
I think maybe many people don't know, or if you haven't been through it, you have to remember healthcare complications aren't something you can plan for. And so the treatment to do miscarriage management to help someone who is having complications with their pregnancy is medically the same treatment that you would do in the case of a pregnancy termination. And so a lot of healthcare providers are now in this complicated space of trying to figure out if they're helping someone with an ectopic pregnancy, which could kill you. West Virginia is a great example. Currently, they are trying to put forward an abortion ban that wouldn't actually allow for the care of an ectopic pregnancy, but after a 48-hour waiting period. And so those are the kinds of things where legislation just doesn't match the reality of healthcare. And so, we've seen people who are speaking out. There's great articles about 12-year-olds speaking out in the West Virginia state legislatures about people linking arms and surrounding the Indiana state capitol. Again, they're just not popular decisions that state legislators, and they're not reflective of where their constituents stand at all. And so, we've seen that doctors are having to make really hard choices, and intimidation by doctors also when they're making the decisions to help patients who travel from other states. And as we saw in Indiana, when a doctor helped a 10-year-old rape victim.
How rare is that, or I guess or how frequent is that girls that young have been raped and need therapeutic abortion?
Well, I'll just quote Dr. Caitlin Bernard, the Indiana doctor who did provide care to that 10-year-old. She says that she's not the only provider who needs in this last month to take care of a young child who had to come from Ohio to Indiana. And in fact, she mentioned that since she had to take care of that 10-year-old, there have been additional 11-year-olds who needed care. And so, how state legislators can be on the side of forced pregnancy, even in those circumstances, is really extreme. I think that extremism is going to be rejected this fall.
How about medicated abortions? Are they covered by these state laws as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think attributing to the confusion that has been happening, when a state makes and passes into law and effective a decision to ban abortion, that also includes medication abortion. And that has been really confusing for people. And it's a ban is a ban is a ban, and so on medication abortion, it still applies. So we are seeing, concern from folks who maybe you travel out of state, get your medication, and you take that medication, come back to a state. If you have complications, providers are concerned about providing care to someone who at this point, isn't in need of an abortion. They're in need of managing an emergency situation. But we're still seeing, some hesitancy and concern there. We have been at Planned Parenthood working to expand telemedicine, which include for medication abortion in the places where legally allowable. And that means that someone, would limit their time that they have to be in a health center or travel. That is important. And it's also critical that the Biden-Harris administration has further reiterated to pharmacies, sending out guidance to pharmacies, naming that they do have to provide this prescription medication where available. And so even in a state where it's legal, we've started to see instances of pharmacists not wanting to give the actual medication to a patient. So that reiteration from the Biden-Harris administration was very important.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.